With the U.S. Supreme Court striking down President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs, is global trade policy entering a new phase of judicial scrutiny and economic recalibration? Good morning and welcome to another power-packed episode of Business Week. This week, the U.S. Supreme Court has dealt a blow to one of Trump's signature economic policies, rebuking the tariff framework that reshaped America's trade stance. In Nigeria, a new survey shows that 65% of Nigerians want lower interest rates as the Monetary Policy Committee prepares to convene next week. Concurrently, PENCOM's revised equity limits are set to unleash an estimated 5 trillion naira liquidity wave on the Nigerian exchange, and Central Bank Governor Olayemi Cardoso says Nigeria is playing a strategic role in advancing Africa's single currency plan. Elsewhere across the continent, African nations are rushing to sell dollar bonds as borrowing costs ease, seizing a window of opportunity in the global capital markets. In Britain, startups are increasingly turning to artificial intelligence tools instead of costly new hires, reflecting a shift in business models amid tighter funding conditions. And in a positive signal for Africa's largest economy, Nigeria's inflation rate has dropped to 15.1%, offering cautious optimism for businesses and households alike. Later in the show, we'll discuss Nigeria's pension boom with two key voices contributing to the industry's growth. If you missed any of the week's biggest business stories, don't worry, I'm here to help you catch up. I'm Abby Owolawi. Stay with us. Let's take a look at how the markets performed this week. We begin with week-on-week commodities performance as at Friday, the 20th of February. While oil prices hovering near 6-month highs on Friday, headed for their first weekly gain in 3 ongoing concerns of an impending conflict. Brent crude was up by 5.69% on a weekly basis to $71.37 a barrel, while US WTI crude was at $66.07 a barrel, up by 5.37% from last week. A look now at the Nigerian Stock Exchange at the end of last weekday of trading, a total of 820.5 million shares in 63,507 deals, corresponding to a market value of 28.32 billion naira, were traded. Now, compared to Friday, February 13th, 2025, yesterday's data showed a 12.38% drop in volume and a 26.84% rise in deals. The current market capitalization of the Nigerian Stock Exchange is 125.16 trillion naira. Let's now take a look at the weekly performance across African markets. Starting in South Africa, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange closed at 123 and 22.06, marking a rise of 2.02% week on week from February 13th, 2026. In Ghana, we saw positive movement with the index rising on a weekly basis by 14.57% and closing at 11,758.96. In Kenya, the Nairobi Stock Exchange closed downward by 3.14%, with the index ending at 209.88. Finally, Morocco's Mersey closed at 18,701.04 there, up by 0.69% on a weekly basis. A look now at European markets, where the regional stock 600 rose by 1.99% on a week-on-week basis from February 13th, 2026, and the German DAX index was seen up there by 1.37%. France's CAC 40 index rose by 2.33%, while the UK's FTSE 100 rose by 2.49%, and we also see Spain's IBEX 35-day advancing by 2.63% on a weekly basis. Finally, let's take a look at Wall Street as at Friday, February 20th, 2026. The Dow Jones Industrial Average trading there at 0.22% lower than last week. On Fridays, the S&P 500 rose by 0.65% on a weekly basis. We also saw the Nasdaq Composite advancing there by 1.28% week on week. Let's now take you to our top stories for the week. Delivering a major blow to President Donald Trump, the U.S. Supreme Court on Friday ruled that he exceeded his authority when imposing sweeping tariffs using a law reserved for a national emergency. But justices divided 6-3 held that Trump's aggressive approach to tariffs on products entering the United States from across the world was not permitted under the 1977 law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Now, this is a rare setback for the administration at the Supreme Court, which has had a 6-8 conservative majority since Trump began his second term in January. The decision does not affect all of Trump's tariffs, leaving in place ones he imposed on steel and aluminum using different laws. But it uphands his tariffs in two categories. And in response to this, President Donald Trump declared on Friday that he is absolutely ashamed of the Supreme Court justices who voted to strike his tariffs down, calling the decision deeply disappointing. The High Court ruled out Trump's sweeping unilateral tariffs in a 6-3 decision. Now, on the heels of the Supreme Court defeat, President Donald Trump said he will sign an executive order that will impose a 10% global tariff under a federal law known as Section 122. The president also says he's exploring other tariffs through other avenues.
Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country. I'd like to thank and congratulate Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh for their strength and wisdom and love of our country, which is right now very proud of those justices. When you read the dissenting opinions, there's no way that anyone can argue against them. There's no way. Foreign countries that have been ripping us off for years are ecstatic. They're so happy. And they're dancing in the streets, but they won't be dancing for long, that I can assure you. The Democrats on the court are thrilled, but they will automatically vote no. They're an automatic no, just like in Congress. They're an automatic no. They're against anything that makes America strong, healthy, and great again. They also are a, frankly, disgrace to our nation, those justices. They're an automatic no, no matter how good a case you have. It's a. But now I'm going to go in a different direction, probably the direction that I should have gone the first time, but I read the language. I'm very good at reading language, and it read our way 100%, but now I'll go the way I could have gone originally, which is even stronger than our original choice. Therefore, effective immediately, all national security tariffs under Section 232 and existing Section 301 tariffs, they're existing, they're there, remain in place, fully in place, and in full force and effect. Today, I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122, over and above our normal tariffs already being charged. And we're also initiating several Section 301 and other investigations to protect our country from unfair trading practices of other countries and companies.
U.S. economic growth cooled near the end of 2025, according to data released earlier. That could push the Federal Reserve into lowering interest rates. Now, we have GDP rising at an annualized rate of just 1.4%, according to Commerce Department numbers, adjusted for seasonality and inflation. Now, at the same time, U.S. inflation held firm in December, according to the gauge most closely watched by the federal officials, that is. Now, the core personal consumption expenditures price index rose by 3% in December, according to a separate release. That matched the consensus forecast, but kept the pivotal inflation measure well above the Fed's 2% target. UK inflation eased to 3% in January, matching economists' expectations according to the latest figures from the ONS. Now, core inflation edged lower to 3.1% from 3.2%. And the slowdown hitting its lowest annual rate since March 2025 was partly driven by falling petrol prices, according to ONS chief economist Grant Fisner on X. Now, British entrepreneurship appears to be on the rise, with thousands of new businesses popping up. The problem, though, was that workers, these startups are increasingly using artificial intelligence and freelancers instead of taking on permanent staff. New firms launched in the UK last year generated an average of 2.7 jobs each, around one fewer than when records began in 2017, according to a Bloomberg analysis of official data. Now, total employment created by new enterprises fell 16% to the lowest level on record. And European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde says she expects to complete her term through October 2027, dismissing reports that she might step down early to influence the selection of her successor before France's next presidential election. Lagarde told the Wall Street Journal that her focus remains on consolidating the ECB's achievements and ensuring stability in European monetary policy. She also reassured fellow policymakers that any decision to leave early will come directly from her and not the press. Kenya and Ivory Coast are the latest African nations to return to the international bond market, seeking to take advantage of the lower borrowing costs and a risk on their sentiment to raise funds. Kenya, which had its credit rating raised by Moody's ratings in January, will sell new debt and buy back Eurobonds due in 2032 and 2028. Now, Nigeria's headline inflation rate eased to 15.1% in January 2026, according to the latest Consumer Price Index report released on Monday. The CPI declined to 127.4 in January following the completion of the rebasing exercise. The year-on-year headline inflation rate fell marginally from 15.15% in December 2025 and significantly from 27.61% recorded in January 2025, while the month-on-month rate stood at negative 2.88% compared to 0.54% in December. Now, as the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Nigeria prepares to meet next week, new survey data shows that a majority of Nigerians favor lower lending rates, even as concerns about inflation remain widespread. Findings from the CBN's January 2026 Household Expectation Survey show that 65% of respondents believe that lending interest rates should fall, while 12.2% prefer an increase and 15.1% want rates to remain unchanged. About 7.7% expressed no opinion. Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Olayemi Cardoso, has said Nigeria is playing a pivotal role in advancing Africa's single currency agenda. In a statement issued on Monday in Abuja, Cardoso noted that Nigeria's hosting of the African Monetary Institute and eventually the African Central Bank positions the country at the heart of Africa's emerging monetary union and strengthens its influence in shaping the continent's single currency framework. Now, PENCOM's upward revision of equity exposure limits for retirement savings accounts has unleashed what analysts estimate could be nearly 1 trillion naira in fresh liquidity into the Nigerian Exchange Limited. The development, confirmed by market operators and investment research firms, including Alpha Seven Asset Management and Cardinal Stone Research, has already triggered a sharp repricing across large-cap stocks. With total pension assets now exceeding 26 trillion naira, the recalibration of allocation limits is stirring a significant pool of long-term domestic capital, reinforcing institutional participation in equities and complementing reforms in the foreign exchange market. And that's it for our top stories.